So howdy, everybody. Welcome, and welcome to those who are still about to join us. My name's Lucas Livingston. I'm with the Chicago Museum, and I'm excited for our event today, all through the whole month of October. This month we've been focusing on programming and topics that certainly just wanting to encourage all of us to exercise one of our greatest rights in this country, which is the right to vote. And so certainly various topics that we've been discussing: women's suffrage movement, people of color in the history of the American suffrage movement. And then this week today, we're going to be focusing on the history of the United States Postal Service, and just how, as we have all been learning, how integral it is to, as a institution, part of the United States, that we almost, I don't want to say this, my apologies, Lynn, almost take for granted historically the just critical significance of the United States Postal Service in our nation's history, and also as a critical aspect in exercising that right to vote. And so, but without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our illustrious speaker for the hour, Lynn Heidelbaugh. Lynn's a curator at the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum. And there she specializes in the history of the United States Postal Service, military mail, and the material culture of letter writing. I just love that phrase, material culture. I'm all about material culture, but I'm usually digging into like ancient pots and things like that. But you know, there she's served as lead curator for several exhibitions. Pardon me for reading a few of these here, Lynn, but Behind the Badge, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and My Fellow Soldiers, Letters from World War I. And you actually got a prize for that, the Smithsonian Secretary's Research Award. So congrats belatedly. Yeah, you recently submitted your manuscript to Indiana University Press for co-authored book about the Civil War letters exchanged between soldiers and their families on the Indiana home front, my Hoosier state. So, Lynn, welcome, and thanks so much for being here and joining us, sharing your time and expertise and passion with us. So I'll hand the mic on over to you, Lynn. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucas, and thank you to the Chicago Brew Museum too for the invitation to speak about postal history. So I'm going to work on sharing my screen here. Hit the buttons. Yeah. All right, y'all see the slide here? Yeah, all right, good. Perfect. It's good to have some validation there during the talk. Right. It's very strange to be doing Zoom talk, and I see lots of audience names in there, so it's great to see those. And I'm pleased to be speaking about the history of the post office today. And I will I'll start it off with a bit of a brew-related, beer-related joke, in that a man walked into a bar, and the man walked into a bar with a mailbag. And I want to tell you about Fairbanks Tavern and 1639 and the first official post office in North America. So on the map here of Boston, there's a location that my cursor will go over. Let's see if we'll get that right about here, which is just down the street from present day the old state Capitol building. And it was the home of Richard Fairbanks, who moved to Massachusetts in 1635 with his wife and 2 children, and became a proprietor of a tavern with a license to sell alcohol. And taverns at this time, coffee houses, they were places where people gathered like they do today. But at that time, it was a place where you could get your news. You would see broadsides that would be hanging around, distributed between people. It was a place where you often went to go and pick up letters and also drop them off for the next outgoing ship. And that's exactly what this tavern became designated as a post office to collect that incoming and outgoing overseas mail. So as the Massachusetts General Court said in November of 1639, they gave notice that, quote, given that Richard Fairbanks, his house in Boston, is the place appointed for all letters which are brought from beyond the seas, or are to be sent thither, are to be brought unto, and he is to take care that they be delivered or sent according to their directions, and he is allowed for every such letter 1 penny. And so here he is. He's a proprietor of the tavern, proprietor of the mail bag, but this is a royal post office mail bag. This is mail under the regulations of the British Imperial Post. And that mail bag would have been handled by the sea captains who were doing the transatlantic voyages. So they would have dropped off a bag, left it there for maybe a week or two or so as word went out that they were about to set off for the next voyage, and you should put your mail in there to be outgoing mail. The same for anything incoming. The word of mouth would spread in town that a ship had arrived, that the mail would be ready to be picked up at Richard Fairbanks's tavern. And in that mail was generally, it was government mail because they're dealing with colonial governance. And a lot of it is merchant, the commerce and business related. That's really where the information and communication was going on during the decades of the first British colonies in North America. It was not so much the communications between the colonies, but back to their home countries, home states, speaking with, again, government officials and business. So it's really not what we think of a lot today of goods going through the mail or personal letters in the mail. This was pretty much all business, and it would remain so for the next several hundred years. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about some of those origin stories. And that's one version of an origin story for the Postal Service in America. We speak of some others at the Postal Museum, and I thought I would show you one of our galleries in downtown Washington, D.C. We are currently closed as lots of the Smithsonian museums are reopening during the pandemic, and we have plans to as well. But in the meantime, go visit us online and go in depth in some of these stories I'm going to introduce to you today. But at the core of, where does the post office begin in America? At the core, it's really how have those definitions changed over time? How have we created that post office, but also redefined that? And how have we redefined the information infrastructure for the country? It's been the main way that we have communicated for the history of America. It's the method of moving our information over distances, and it's the way that information really is material goods. As Lucas was saying, I specialize in material culture, and unlike a telegraph, telephone, radio, television broadcast, satellites, the goods that are in the mail are physical forms and take a particular kind of logistics for that. A fair amount of that is in the transportation, like the sea captain going into Fairbanks's tavern. What you can see in the gallery here are the trucks and airplanes. You can see some horses in the background are carrying a stagecoach, which was had mail along with its passengers on routes through most of the 19th century, moving the mail through small areas of small routes and long routes in the US. And as those networks, they grew out of that tradition, like Richard Fairbanks' tavern, of being a postal service for and by the monarchies. Of European monarchies ran post offices for their own communication, and it was their prerogative whether they were going to grant access to those outside of the government. And the US postal system derives, many of its foundations from the British royal governance of mail in colonial America. And it also derives from the revolutionaries' reaction to that postal service. And it was a direct reaction to the monarchist system. In large part, that system, which was allowed for the opening of the mail and surveillance of the mail. It also has influenced how we have viewed the postal monopoly, the role of revenue, and what constitutes service. And like Lucas said in his great introduction there, it's a thing that we have often taken for granted because it is so everyday and mundane, but there's a great complexity to this system of running the logistics of the postal network. And those are defined and redefined by the interests of the era. So I have a couple of eras that we're going to go into, and this one is our early nation building. So this is just after the British Royal Mail System has been taken over by the revolutionaries, or not so much taken over, but the revolutionaries start their own system alongside the British Royal Mail in order that they can conduct that business of revolution, so that their mail is not being looked at, their correspondence as they're subverting the government is not being looked at, and so the British should be not aware of what the revolutionaries are planning. And who becomes the first Postmaster General in working the post office for the revolutionaries was a former postmaster for the Royal Post himself. So Benjamin Franklin, his portrait is seen there. He had had several decades working as a postmaster for Philadelphia, and later became a Postmaster General, Joint Postmaster General with William Hunter in 1753. And like many of his actual trade, which was being a printer, they also wanted to be postmaster because postmaster controlled the information. They were the first to get those letters that were coming in from overseas, like Richard Fairbanks was getting in his tavern. They would, printers, if they were postmaster, would get the letters there. They would be able to interact with the people coming into the post office to pick up their letters. They would ask them, hey, is there anything interesting, gossip, news of the day, news from overseas that I can print in the newspaper? They also had access to the newspapers and be able to reprint news from other broadsides themselves. And so Franklin, wanting to sort of corner the market in Philadelphia and printing of his Pennsylvania Gazette, worked as the postmaster and used that as his information source. As he became Postmaster General, he and William Hunter were able to, for the first time, turn a profit for the British Royal Post in the 1750s. And in their first 3 years, they actually quadrupled the profits. And the British Royal Post had really been pushing for revenue generation out of the colonial mail system. And it was one that Franklin then went to argue to Parliament shouldn't be the system, because actually he said there were too many ways that people were circumventing the mail, that actually it was a service that they could opt into, or they could choose not to use the mail. And so rather than being a tax, it should be a service fee. And it's part of the whole dialogue and so for the generation of what's fomenting under the revolutionary discussions of the 1760s and 1770s. And while one of the reasons why Franklin is dismissed as Postmaster General in 1774. But as he becomes appointed under the new constitutional post, under the new constitutional governance of the states, it's not his ideas and the way that he worked and constructed the post office under the British, but rather another printer whose ideals became the structure for that post office. It was another printer by the name of William Goddard, who worked out of Connecticut. And Goddard in 1774 put together his ideals of how a post office should run, and how he was running his own post riders outside the British mail system. And in the copy that you see here from the Essex Gazette, which was out of Salem, Massachusetts, his fellow printers put his proposal in. And in the body of that is really the principles we have today about open communication, freedom from government interference in the content of the mail, and a guaranteed free exchange of ideas. And what could be more important to like revolutionaries than to be able to freely exchange and keep essentially all their messages private. And so when the Congress, Constitutional Congress adopted this in July 1775, they passed over Goddard and gave the job to Benjamin Franklin. He had a good track record, so you got to give him that. And as the Constitutional Post then became part of the Constitution, really the body of it still remains somewhat in the essence of keeping the privacy in there. But as it turned into part of the legislation, the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 7, it's a very simplified clause, just saying to establish post offices and post roads. And I'll go a little bit more into what's a post road in a bit, but that becomes a great part of the debate over the next several decades. It really becomes solidified and takes several years, not just the Constitution, but every year between 1789 and 1792, Congress passes temporary measures to maintain a postal system. And not until the Act of 1792 is there an expressly stated Postal Act that really defines what is the post office doing and how is it doing the work. Many of those ideals taken again from Goddard, including privacy issues. So in that 1792 Act, which many historians date as maybe the real beginning of what is the foundation of the Postal Service today and the ideals that are upheld in that, it codified that Congress maintains the primary control over postal policy. That, however, it forbade the opening of letters. You couldn't use those as a tool or surveillance. It also admitted newspapers into the mail as at a very low rate. And so it was facilitating that spread of information that was deemed necessary to have informed citizenry and those who had voting rights to be able to know the news of the day. It also prohibited private carriage of letters on post roads. So let me tell you a little bit more about those post roads. So in 1796, an employee of the Post Office Department created this map. It's a map, you can see it's mostly the eastern seaboard, which had been the main postal areas and main population areas of the colonies. And on it, he designates all the routes that were going inland. So very different from where we started off with Fairbanks' Tavern. These are now lots of inland routes. But by 1796, there were about 500 post offices in the US. Tennessee had just gained its statehood, and there were about 5 million people living in the US. And as you can see, there's no Illinois, if you're looking at it on here. There is the Western Territories, and Fort Chicago is spelled with a K, but there are no post offices in Chicago at this time. And the principles set out in that 1792 Act were really helping this network grow. They were helping the funds to go into what was being designated as post roads. They were expanding that definition to waterways in the 1820s, became designated as able to be funded by federal funds. And then later the railways in the 1830s. And soon in the 1860s, streets as well, streets and cities. And I'll come to that in a bit and why that becomes important in postal history. But the objective really remained quite the same from 1792 through 1845, that the money that was being produced and the revenue produced from postal work, from the conveyance of the letters, the newspapers, and the mail, was to go back into establishing and maintaining these roads and offices. It really quite changes in new legislation in 1840s and 50s and 60s, and with some new innovations here too. There's new definitions of what's mailable, and same time an increased control of the content of the mail. They were responding, the postal officials and Congress, to changes in the population, changes to the expansion of the nation, new technologies, and new commercial opportunities, the establishment of states across the continent, and the addition of territories. And so one thing that they were doing to encourage this growing population to use the mail was to reduce the rates, which radically were reduced in 1845, 1851, and 1863. Also coupled with the introduction of the postage stamps that you see up here at the top of the screen, which was revolutionary in terms of now mail could be prepaid. So it was no longer the recipient who paid for getting the letter, it was the sender who was paying for it, which had the bonus for the post office that they were ensuring that they were getting paid to do the work before they did the work. So that certainly helped with the revenue generation. It also made the mail somewhat more accessible, as the rates had been slashed in 1845. And in 1863, they took away the factor of distance in the mail. So it's actually just the weight of the mail itself that becomes how much the mail costs, rather than mail and distance, thus geographically uniting the nation just in the middle of the Civil War, while it's in its height and being divided by the war. It's now can bridge those distances through the mail, though not bridge the distances between the North and South states, where the mail had been stopped from being able to be cross the lines. And the war was one of the things that really had people writing as they were being separated, as husbands and brothers and fathers were going off to war. More people were writing letters. They were able to write the letters because of those affordable postage rates. And places, outposts in the West, were also seeking to have communication, both for very personal reasons now, that and keeping in contact with family members who may be left behind on the East Coast as they set out towards the West, towards the gold fields of California. And as the photo here is showing in 1863, this is in one of the most northern territories at the time, in North Dakota, right along the Canadian border at Pabina, North Dakota, and at that time, the Dakota Territories. The postmaster was a federal employee. He had great experience with being a customs inspector right along that Canadian border, and lots of the lucrative fur trade business. And so when he opened up the post office, it was definitely a part of the large and growing commercial network of his business. And also people were seeking other ways to engage in growing commerce during the time, to engage in the newfound wealth in the gold fields of the West, the silver mines of the West. And so folks like those of William Russell, Alexander Majors, and William Waddell set up the Pony Express service in hopes of getting a very lucrative government contract. Although the Pony Express did not receive a mail contract, they did carry the mail under a separate cover and were an express company, noted for helping to deliver the news of Lincoln's election in 1860 in a phenomenal time period of just 7 days of having the mail move from the East Coast to the West Coast. Actually, just a little bit under 8 days. But looking for ways to move the mail more rapidly, and as the population spread out, became a factor in the cities as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the competitions and monopoly debate that was going on in the 1840s and 1860s. And again, this kind of all hinges on what is a post road. And in cities, large urban areas, particularly along the East Coast, they started to, companies started to set up small private courier services. You can see the collection box here from Philadelphia, which was Blood's Penny Post. And by 1839, there were just 2 private posts that were in competition with the post office department. By the 1840s, there were over 150 local post carriers moving the mail within cities. And like the Chicago Penny Post postage stamp that you see here, that operated for only 1 year, but, and actually this one is a forgery that's in our collection. But that operation, which announced its opening in 1862 and said that it would move mail within the city, and then it would take any outbound mail going to other cities, it would take that to the general post office for you. So it was people were looking for convenience. But the post office department was not looking very favorably upon this. And lawsuits were brought against these companies because of saying that they were using what should be designated as post roads, these city streets that were receiving federal funds to be built and maintained. And that's where many of the competition was shut down, and these companies pretty much had gone out of business by the time Chicago Penny Post started. Most of the others had also disappeared before then, and really solidified the postal monopoly on letter class mail. And as people were becoming more wanting that sort of convenience of their mail to their door, not having to go to the post office, delivery becomes the way that the post office department defines their interactions with customers. And this begins in 1863, just at that tail end of the competition with the private express companies within the cities. And the post office begins to distribute free delivery within cities in 1863 at the suggestion of a clerk from Cleveland, Ohio, who said he was distraught at seeing the women who had to line up for the mail and wait to get war news during the height of the Civil War, and wait to hear about how their family members who were off fighting the war, and wait to get their correspondence, and did not want to see women in tears in public anymore, and that they should be able to be in the privacy of their home, receive these very emotional letters. And sort of from that very personal experience, personal motivation, some of the delivery aspects arise. And coupled with that, it goes somewhat hand in hand as an opportunity for employment for veterans of the Civil War. And as the cities are, and the post office is expanding the delivery network within the cities, they need a new workforce. And many veterans from the Civil War find employment with the post office department at this time. And it's not until nearly the turn of the 20th century do the same free delivery privileges get extended to rural Americans. And the employment opportunities for rural carriers were quite different. Unlike the gentlemen you see here who are wearing uniforms and have their badges with caps and identifying themselves as they approach your door, knock on your door, and leave parcels and letters for you. A rural carrier did not have to have a uniform. They were generally leaving the mail at a mailbox at the end of a lane, and didn't have as much personal interaction. They had far more autonomy, but they also had to supply their own equipment of horse and cart or truck. And so it's quite a different craft and work experience between rural and urban delivery carriers throughout the early 20th century. And it also begins the way that most Americans are interacting with their post office. They're no longer going to the post office to pick up the mail. The mail is coming to them, and it's coming to them 6 days a week. From the beginning in 1863, it was coming from Monday through Saturday, and you could pay extra for special messenger delivery, and those would even go out on Sunday as well. So many of our concepts of what we're familiar with today begin in the mid-19th century. But that didn't stop innovation, in particularly a modernizing period of the early 20th century. And this is a period where the mail volume also starts to rise as going hand in hand with population and economics of the US. There are new innovations being tried, and the post office department puts those into deployment right away as well. They put trucks in the city streets to move heavy mail bags around and station those for the letter carriers to go and pick up and continue their routes. They begin with the first airmail service route in, well, actually it was just an experiment in 1911 between Petaluma and Santa Rosa, California. And that 20-mile distance was flown on that flight, on that airplane, much like the one that you see here on this stamp for 20-cent stamp. Took him 2 days to cover just 20 miles, the pilot. And it wasn't until 1918 did airmail service become a regular route service, much like the earlier services in the US along the East Coast first, along the business, highly concentrated business districts, and then completing a transcontinental network just 100 years ago. So from experimenting with that, it didn't mean that some of the old ways went out as well. So you can see from the emblem that I have at the top of the screen here, this is the Post Office Department emblem for the period in 1950s and 1960s. And it depicts the post rider much like the post riders of the colonial period. But actually the last horses used by the post office were still on city streets in Philadelphia in the 1950s. But the changing nature of the technology also changed who was working as well. And the photograph here has Jeanette Lee, who's one of the first letter carriers during World War II, first female letter carriers. And she was working in Chicago and was one of just a handful at the time of female letter carriers. She was kind of part of the wave of women entering the workforce, particularly the postal workforce, that had been brought about during staffing issues of men being drafted and volunteering for the war. It was something similar had happened during the Civil War and again during World War I. But this time, like Jeanette Lee and her other counterparts, they remained employed with the post office department, whereas their counterparts in prior generations had not. One thing that had changed was how they were sorting the mail at the time too, particularly the inner city mail, larger urban city mail. The post office experimented what was called zone codes, and it was a 2-digit number that would help new letter carriers be able to sort the mail quickly so that they didn't have to know all the neighborhoods and city streets. So someone like Jeanette Lee would pick up, be able to sort her routes quite quickly. But even with those kind of innovations, it really was not enough to keep up with the amount of mail. Innovations like the zone improvement plan, you can see from the poster above showing an iconic Mr. Zip as he's speeding the mail with just 5 digits that you'll add to your address. This was all designed to try to help move the great volume of mail that was being generated in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. It had grown so much, it had increased over 200% in amount of mail in that period. And when zip code was introduced in 1963, it created a way that would help automation, that using a numerical designation for the geographic areas meant that it was no longer just up to an individual, but that item could be used new computers to help sort and move that mail. It wasn't enough, however, and in 1966, famously the Chicago Main Post Office in the photo below became so overwhelmed with mail that it shut down for 3 weeks. This was the world's largest postal facility at its time, and there was an estimated 10 million pieces of mail that had been stacked up. It just was not, the facility was not large enough, it was not staffed adequately enough, that equipment was outdated, and studies showed that it was not that it was those weeks leading up to it, days leading up to it, but really decades of needing innovation. And although the zip code and other measures of mechanization and automation had been being introduced in the years prior, it really just had been not substantial enough. That in 1967, a presidential commission was formed to look at how could the Post Office Department meet the demands of the population and the growing economy. And that report from '68 said that the post office was not running like a business and that managers did not have authority. From that grew what became the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970 and creation of the U.S. Postal Service as of 1971. It's some of the areas that you'll hear about in the news today of how is the post office, who's the authority, where is the government control of the funding? Where does the self-sustaining revenue go back into the system? And what is the role of a long-standing mandate of universal service? That's the minimum level of service for a reasonable price. These are continuing debates from before the Postal Service was created and continue today. So I know I'm running a little bit out of time, but I wanted to circle back to the beginning a bit and back to what does it mean to get the mail, and how has that changed from being at that tavern at Richard Fairbanks's tavern. And it has been a huge revolution and evolution from very business-oriented, government-oriented mail to very personal mail. Like the advertisement here from World War II, this item was put out by the Brewers Industry Foundation with the tagline, "Morale is a lot of little things." And that morale here is built on the letter. This is, as the image shows, it's a letter being exchanged from a service member to his family who are carving a pumpkin and enjoying a beer. But it's that connection that the mail is building. So it's no longer about conducting the business, although this is a business, the Industry Foundation using the mail as part of its promotion, and that very, very strong relationships that mail helps build and sustain, that they're trying to make a connection to, that it's a patriotic act to write a letter. It's also patriotic to keep those ideals of what is American at the time. So enjoying a beer in a wholesome setting, like being at home with family. But also the ideal of where the Americans interacted with the post office has changed radically over time, from being one where people were going to the post office to being the post office coming to people's door. And that's can be seen in the uniform. It's actually a costume from the television show Cheers that ran in the 1980s, 1990s. And this was the costume for the character Cliff Clavin, who was a letter carrier who frequented a bar in Boston. And emblematic of how people's interactions with the post office had changed from being one that came to their door, came to their home 6 days a week. So I look forward to your questions and conversation.
Wonderful. Oh, fantastic. Thanks so much, Lynn. Yeah, this is really interesting. So much that I didn't, well, not that I even profess to know anything much about the USPS before this, but a really interesting history and story. I love the fact that, and properly, rightly so, you felt compelled to kind of explain Cliff Clavin, the story Cheers and all of that, you know, just some, I guess maybe there are some people out there who don't know the full story backwards and forwards, front and back and all of that. But yeah, so maybe I'm just showing my age, I don't know. So but no, very interesting. So yeah, certainly some if anybody has questions, thoughts, comments, definitely put those in the chat, and we'll field some of those here. It was interesting, you mentioned that a lot of debate that historically has gone on and continues to go on, and just things are not always cut and dry, and some decisions that are made could sometimes be controversial as well. And so, yeah, a great question that Greg posed here in the chat, that when the workforce was unionized, when was the workforce unionized, and was that a controversial measure?
Different crafts within the post office department began unionizing in the late 19th century, and along with a wave of labor in many different industries unionizing. And so, yeah, it's always, unions have long been controversial in U.S. and other countries' histories, with giving voice to the labor, and being able to bargain collectively. So there has been controversy within unions as well over the years, and some real redefining some of that definition of the unions and their relationship within that Postal Reorganization Act as well. So very modernized approach in the 1970 Postal Reorganization Act as well.
Yeah, Liz makes a good point. Something that probably on a few of our minds too, just and getting back to Cheers, because I'm a huge fan, but just, you know, I'm sure that well, it says that's apropos that the first post office was located in a Boston tavern, and that pop culture's most famous mailman was a regular in a Boston tavern. Yeah, it certainly would certainly make Cliff Clavin proud. I don't know if they ever brought that up in the whole series, but
I don't know. I was curious. I need to look into that. But
right.
When I was pulling up the images for that piece, I was thinking it kind of looks silly next to the other Halloween theme there of sort of the headless endless mannequin we have there. But it's a piece that actually, that uniform was made by a manufacturing company that makes letter carrier uniforms. So that is an authentic piece, but just happened to be used for the television series.
Cool. Yeah, and a quick question that was on my mind too. You mentioned just having items in the collection of the National Postal Museum. I was wondering, just as a government entity, the Smithsonian, are maybe you don't know the answer to this off the top of your head, but are all of the images in the public domain? Do you know that or not?
Yes and no. The public domain images are anything generated by the federal government. So if you get photographs of the post office department before the creation of the Postal Service, those are federal government photographs. Those are public domain if they were created by the post office department. And other materials are subject to different trademarks and copyrights and renewals, and as well as the stamp issues have, there are different dates where those are created. Those are created as the Post Office Department being a federal agency. Those would be public domain images. And then under Postal Service, a different set of copyright issues apply.
So, but images of all stamps are not necessarily in the public
domain? Not
domain,
necessarily, right. So if you're looking at Post Office Department era as federally created items, yeah.
Okay, all right. It's complicated. Yeah, sure. Well,
yes, it is very complicated. It's, as many of image use these days gets very complicated, and licensing of images on images of images is a complex.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Time to call your intellectual property counsel.
Yeah, no kidding. For sure, for sure.
Actually, but speaking about what is public domain, but the Smithsonian has created their as much public access as possible, and in deeming more items that are online from the collections are open access. So those areas that have been kind of checked and cleared as public domain are able to be downloaded, open access, and used freely. And it'll say that on, if you go to the Smithsonian's collection search site, you'll be able to see items that are marked for open access.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, and Susan posed a question. I'm not sure, you might have mentioned something I missed, but she said, can you explain what you mean by crafts in the Postal Service?
Yeah, so there's hundreds of different types of jobs in working the specialties of the Post Office Department, and they're often referred to as crafts. So in terms of learning the ways and the skills of those jobs, it's deemed as a craftsmanship and a knowledge base. And so they're typically referred to, whether you're a letter carrier, takes very different knowledge and skills from a mail handler to a clerk. It doesn't mean that they're not transportable and changeable within, and people move from one to the other, but there is an identity and terms used as sort of a craftsmanship within specialties.
Okay, yeah, craft as in like a trade almost. Yeah, or maybe one of our nation's largest guilds, or guilds within guilds. Well, yeah, and that reminds me also, I think maybe in a phone call we had earlier, we were talking about just how the USPS is one of our nation's largest employers. And you touched on also how during the wartime effort, we saw, or both multiple different wars, we saw yeah, a lot of women entering the workforce in the USPS, the Postal Service, and other workforces. And did you mention it was only around like post World War II when that kind of transitioned to be like a permanent shift, that women stayed in the workforce? But then historically, is the USPS one of the like the largest employers of historically marginalized populations, women and people of color and such? Is that, I guess that's my question. And is that so? And I don't know, is there any just more of a story behind that, or not so much?
Yeah, there is. That could be a whole other lecture. It's a fascinating development of employment and opportunity, and a reduction of opportunity as well, and then an increase again. So it's there were women who were actually, had mentioned William Goddard being a printer. His sister was actually a printer, and probably one the first or maybe second postmaster, female postmaster in the U.S. Under Colonial Post. And she lost her job under the first Postmaster General, Samuel Osgood, who said women should not be postmasters. So there's a history of employment, particularly in areas for women in being postmasters, the rural routes, which had a lot of autonomy and very different kind of interactions with other workers in post office, very much supplying your own equipment, not having uniforms. There were a fair number of women early on in who had rural route duties, who were substitute carriers for their husbands or sons, and covering their routes when their husbands and sons were taking leave. They were also taking over the postmaster jobs after maybe a husband passed away or grandfather or so forth. There's a tradition of those jobs being passed down to women within the family. A lot of those because of before the 1883 Pendleton Act, getting a job within the federal government was connections of who you knew, and so if your family was known, you would get a job. And it's been an area of opportunity and contraction of opportunity for African Americans for decades as well. So in 1802, there was a law prohibiting African Americans from carrying the mail. And it's not until the Civil War is that law done away with. And after Reconstruction, there's a rise in a number of postmasters who are African Americans in communities around the US and in newly established African American communities, as well as new towns are built. And those also contract as the sort of ideals and hopes of Reconstruction are lost in the 1870s, so very soon after some of those opportunities. But the Pendleton Act and being able to hire people by merit within the federal government does mean that the doors are open to more people. What happened then was reactions, like administrations under President Wilson institutes segregation within the federal workforce as well. So hiring, though merit-based supposed to be, there becomes ways of mandating that photographs are attached to applications so that people are identified, and African Americans are visible on their applications, and that is a concerted effort on part of the administration to limit the numbers. And it's not till the 1920s do some of the dismantling of that segregation start to occur.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, steps forwards and steps back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and talking a lot about hiring practices and all. There was a question over on Facebook. Pam asks, how were rural postmasters chosen back in the 1810s and 1820s? Just mentions, I had an ancestor who was one for a couple of years.
Yeah, 1810s, 1820s. Those are appointments. So probably appointments by the Postmaster General would be. So they're very connected, politically connected jobs at that time. So it's probably somebody well known in the community. If it's one thing to look up for, if you're looking at genealogy kind of research, is see how new is the post office. So many people who were moving to and creating new towns were also asking for a post office to be created, because if you could get a post office in town, you could get the funds for the roads connecting the town. You had a good chance of, as railroads were being built, to try to get your railroad to your town as well, and get some of those connections that way. So if it's a new town, a new postmaster, some of those were kind of creating jobs for themselves as well, particularly the early 19th century.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, right. It's to your point, it's kind of about at certain times who you know, and it's rather politically motivated appointments and all. And I think that also takes us back to taverns. Think about, and that's just the perfect union here, that the concept of the Postal Service in the United States, or even pre-US, but on this in this in colonies, began in the tavern. And wondering, if Liz asks if there were any other at the time or in the future post offices that were located in taverns around the US.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. For the several decades into the early 19th century, being a postmaster was often not the only job, right? You were doing multiple jobs. So like Benjamin Franklin was a printer. There are many people that were adding postmaster appointments to their work as tavern keepers, innkeepers. Later 19th century, the general store. Any place that you can assure that you're getting customers and traffic was of interest to not only the post office, but also the proprietors of those. And so, yes, taverns were very frequently post offices, particularly the early 19th century.
Yeah. No, and I think maybe it makes sense in a way that the places that are frequently patronized, the tavern and general stores and such, they're kind of these gathering places, watering holes, town squares, community platforms. So everybody knows your name. And sorry,
right.
I'm gonna try to make as many Cheers references as I can. I mean, and I think fundamentally an aspect of trust too, that your barkeep, you trust that your barkeep is not cutting the whiskey, and you trust that your barkeep will keep your mail confidential. And so this aspect of this sense of a social bond. So that kind of makes sense to me.
And many of the letters from the time of Richard Fairbanks Tavern to that around 1830s, 40s, where really kind of transitions probably more out of taverns to more sort of general stores and sort of different other venues. It was perfectly what you said, the trust that you have that community, but a lot of that was also sharing that information. These letters from the 1600s to early 19th century were largely about business. So this is information that you probably pass around the tavern and share about, here's the new goods coming into town, and who's going to get delivered what, and what did I just pay, what are you going to pay. So a lot of that kind of talk. There's a lot of early America genre painting that depict the taverns and the news arriving at the post office, which is also the tavern too, and showing that the newspapers that have come in the mail are being handed around as well. So it's not only that information that's sort of physically coming in with the newspapers and the letters, but also that the same environment of that you want to sit and talk to people in a tavern. It's the same kind of, you want to sit and mull over the news of the day on the newspaper and start those debates. And that all comes in through the mail and comes out through enjoying, alcohol at the tavern too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I guess certainly by the time of Prohibition, the Postal Service was entirely its own entity and separated from that whole connection with the taverns. But I don't know. I wonder necessarily, do you know offhand if Prohibition or if the temperance movement if there's any crossovers with the story of the Postal Service?
Yeah, the temperance movement, it does, earlier than Prohibition, there's legislation that there's no alcohol that can be shipped in the mail as early as 1909. So coming out of in the height of some of those temperance movements. So well before Prohibition, but right in the height of those debates going on. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And those still stand.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. A thorn in the side of all of us home brewers. Yeah. It's wonderful. Well, I think what's something you mentioned repeatedly, just this when we're talking about trust, but this fundamental aspect of the U.S. mail being necessarily a private and secure form of communication. That it's illegal to open somebody else's mail, and so, and I think even to this day, I still consider sending something in the mail to be more secure than so many other forms of communication, rather than certainly the least secure form of communication is email. I mean, you might as well just be shouting on a megaphone, and texting and any kind of like social media chat. I mean, there's some various levels of encryption and whatever, but no, I think, like if you want to send secure financial documents and the U.S. mail is still a good way to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and various levels of security that that you can get through added services, whether you are adding registered mail, and that mail is, if you go through adding that service of registered, it'll be locked up and tracked and logged in at every stage. It's where some of the most high valuable items are transported from. The diamond industry uses registered mail. Stock certificates, those financial documents are often use registered mail to ship those out to customers and so forth. So it's, like you said, but it's also, the privacy has, there's also anonymity too in the Postal Service as well, how people can send their letters. You don't have to have a address saying on the outside of who it's coming from on a regular letter.
Yeah, and a level of anonymity for receiving mail too, with a post office box in a sense, to some degree. Right,
and that certainly gives a lot of people security in terms of how they receive their mail, and and having it within a postal facility as well, and
Well, I think we're about good timing. We're about out of time here, and I don't see any hot burning fresh questions in the chat. But certainly, I really thank you so much, Lynn, for this really interesting conversation. Certainly something that's going to resonate with a lot of us for a while. I'm interested in checking out a few things that you discussed, doing a little more research on my own. So
good. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
It's talk about the 200 or 400 year history in half an hour. I know it was a big survey. sort of
yeah,
escaping. But there are so many aspects, which I think you brought up great in the questions, and the audience brought up.
Definitely.
That you can really delve into, and it's a topic many of us don't know about, as being a customer and getting your mail 6 days a week. We don't know how it gets to us, so we don't know until we start to
right.
Now understand what's going on in the news. It's great to look back at the history and start to see where the debates have been before, and see what the issues have been and how they've been handled in the past or not handled too.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Just before everybody signs off, I just do want to mention one quick announcement, something that we all want to maybe mark our calendars for. Hopefully, coming up in less than just a couple weeks away here, we have coming up November 11 through 14, the Chicago Museum is hosting the second annual Beer Culture Summit. That is a multi-day long conference bringing together researchers, scholars, historians, beer industry folks, enthusiasts around beer, and connoisseurs for multiple days of conversation touching on just all aspects of beer culture and beer industry. So definitely tune into that. We're certainly taking a real deep dive, and even sometimes very uncomfortable conversations around aspects of diversity and equity within beer culture and beer industry. So do tune into that. You can subscribe at chicagomuseum.org, sign up for the newsletter, subscribe on social media. Also do check out the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum website, sign up for their newsletter, subscribe on social media, promote, and support our non-for-profit cultural organizations, our museums, especially at this time during great economic insecurity for many, and for many of our undersupported cultural organizations. Do consider supporting them. So thanks everybody. We had a great turnout, great conversation. And this is really fantastic. Thanks again, Lynn, to you and to the Smithsonian for joining us. Really appreciate that. Looking forward to the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Definitely. Cheers. Have a great one.
Cheers.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.